Engamana, engareo, ro rakatirama, tena koto, tena tato katoa. Norera, ko waio, ko Harleen Hain takowingawa, ko te tumuaki o te whariwanaka o a tako aho. Namihi nui kia koto, norera, tena koto, tena tato katoa. Good evening, everyone. My name is Harleen Hain, and I am the Vice Chancellor here at the University of Otago, and it is my absolute pleasure to be here to open this inaugural professorial lecture for Professor Will Sweetman. On behalf of the university, I would like to begin my remarks this evening by extending an extremely warm welcome to the members of the Sweetman family who are here with us this evening. His wife, Alex, and their children, Artie and Tilly, are here in the audience. It's fantastic to have you both here. And I understand that Will's sister might be streaming in from Christchurch as well. Now, the presence of family members, whether in person or virtually, is a very clear signal at these inaugural professorial lectures of how important this milestone is in the inaugural professor's career. I'd also like to acknowledge the presence of staff and students from around the university, including our Pro-Vice Chancellor of Sciences, who has taken time out of his busy schedule to come here today, and also our Chancellor, Dr. Royden Somerville. To each and every one of you who are here this evening, no mai, haramai, welcome. Now, Professor Will Sweetman has an international reputation as a first-class researcher. He's distinguished himself by his meticulous, incisive, and groundbreaking investigations of European writings about religion in South India during the 16th to the 19th centuries. His impressive language skills and his immersion in archival materials have allowed him to make important contributions to the academic study of religion. As you will learn this evening, Professor Sweetman is a passionate teacher and a popular postgraduate supervisor. He excels not only in traditional classroom teaching, but also he's an outstanding distance teacher, where he's developed a suite of extremely distinctive digital courses. Throughout his career, Professor Sweetman's service to his discipline, to his department, and to this university have been numerous, substantial, and valuable. Last, but certainly not least, Will is an extremely collegial and entrepreneurial member of our academic community, and we are extremely lucky to call him one of our own. So Will, on behalf of the University of Otago, it gives me great pleasure to congratulate you personally on your very, very well-deserved promotion to professor. I am very much looking forward to your lecture. I will now call on Dr. John Shaver to tell us just a little bit more about Will's academic journey to professor. Norera, tena koto, tena tato katoa.
Tena koto katoa, ko John Shaver toku ingwa. He pukenga matua o tikanga whakapono aho. No Pittsburgh aho. Ke te mana whenua e mihi ana. Ke nā rangatira o te where wananga o Otako e mihi ana anō. No reira tēnā koto koutou. It is my great honor to introduce Professor Will Sweetman this evening. Will comes with an impressive research record, and I believe I am supposed to focus my time on this record. But given that the title of Will's lecture is Xenology, or the understanding of something foreign, in describing Will's academic journey, I also hope to shed light on the foreign and unique entity that is Professor Will Sweetman. Will began a recent journal article with perhaps the truest sentence he's ever written, and I quote, "No child dreams of becoming a scholar of religion." What an understatement. But there is something common to the work and background of the scholars of religion I admire. They are inquisitive, analytically gifted, and have grown up inside of religion, but critical of it. And Will definitely fits this profile. Will was born in Rhodesia, a child of colonialism. His mother was born in what is now Botswana. Her father arrived in South Africa after deserting from the British Army in India in about 1919. Will's father, from England, went to Rhodesia in 1951 because he couldn't afford a house in London. His father worked as an accountant and was a Methodist lay preacher while he was still working. After retirement, he became an ordained minister. Will and his family moved to England when he was 13, and he eventually attended the University of Lancaster, where he initially sought to study philosophy and maths. Prior to his first year, he was looking for a third subject and wanted to study psychology. But the line for enrollment was long, and so he ended up signing up for the much shorter-lined religious studies. From this inauspicious beginning, owing to laziness, Will embarked on what would become his scholarly passion. After his first year, he lost his desire to study maths and any lingering faith in Christianity, due in part to his exposure to first-year philosophy, but also Lancaster's critical rather than apologetic approach to the study of religions. Will graduated Lancaster with honors and then went on to Cambridge. As anyone who knows Will can attest, he likes to begin just about every other sentence with the phrase, "when I used to row at Cambridge." And that's usually followed by some non sequitur of some kind. But it turns out he did some other things more than rowing while he was there. At Cambridge, Will began work on the colonial construction of Hinduism through the careful study of missionary interpretations of Hinduism. Today, his published work on this topic appears in 3 books, 2 edited volumes, and numerous journal articles and book chapters. Will's work has been important for at least 3 reasons. First, Will has made major contributions to the critical historiography of the term religion and its strategic usage in the context of European imperialism and colonialization and the construction of knowledge about other religions. Secondly, his research has pointed to the significance of the differences between Protestant and Catholic appreciations of Indian religions. Will's research includes studies and translations of French, German, Dutch, and Portuguese sources. These works are now standard references in all histories of Hinduism by Indian and other scholars. Thirdly, Will has worked out the implications of the revised historiography, including his own noteworthy role in this, for our understanding of Hindu and to some extent Indian Buddhist religious traditions. In terms of his professional career, in 1998, Will became a lecturer in religious studies at Middlesex University in London, and then moved to Newcastle, where he was a lecturer from 2000 to 2004. He came to Otago in 2004 and joined the Department of Theology and Religion, where he served as head for 5 years until the programs were split in 2019, and the religion program was moved to the School of Social Sciences. In this move to the School of Social Sciences, of which he is now head, the religion program was able to stand as an independent program thanks to Will's leadership. Just after he was hired at Otago, about a year later, he was the only full-time member of religious studies. But since that time, Will has fostered tremendous growth, and we will soon have 6 full-time staff members. Indeed, I would not be standing here today if it were not for Will. The health of the religion program since Will's arrival is a direct result of his acumen as a leader. In summary, Professor Sweetman's research has made major contributions to the academic study of religions, both to Hindu studies and to the discipline itself. He's acknowledged as a renowned scholar of early European studies of religion and is a strong institutional contributor. He also used to row at Cambridge. With that, allow me to introduce Professor Will Sweetman. Tēnā koutou katoa.
Well, that was excruciating. I thought that might happen, because I've been to one of these before. So I thought I'd make myself feel better and make you all feel better by quoting a little bit of the faint praise with which my work has been damned by people who I regard as friends. Eliza Kent. Some of these are obviously ironic. And the one of which I am perhaps most proud. And here you can see my robustness spilling over my waistband. Okay, I'll start a little more forward. Tēnā koe, Chancellor. Tēnā koe, Vice-Chancellor. Tēnā koe, Pro-Vice-Chancellor, Deputy Vice-Chancellors, John Shaver. Tēnā koutou. Katoa. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I have to begin by thanking my family, of course. My wife, Alex, I think a lot of academics say that they probably couldn't do what they do without their wife. It's true also in my case. In my case, it's true because I can't work when I'm miserable, when I'm unhappy. Alex? You've made me very happy. My children, as you can see, were pioneers long before coronavirus came along. Artie is really the only member of the family who really listens when Dad starts banging on about India and history and the Mahabharata and the like. Until he produced this beautiful poster, which I much prefer to the official version for my lecture. William James, when he was describing the healthy-minded temperament, said that there are people who seem to have started life with a bottle or two of champagne inscribed to their credit. Till he had a whole case. And my colleagues, Greg and Elizabeth, I won't say my oldest colleagues, my colleagues of longer standing, thank you greatly for all the work that you have done in your different ways. Ben and John, my mariners, souls that have toiled and wrought and thought with me, that ever with a frolic welcome took the thunder and the sunshine and opposed free heads, free foreheads. And to my newer colleagues, Joseph and Law and Lena, who's about to join us. Thank you all. And my wider colleagues in the school and in the division and the university, I'm very grateful. It's been a wonderful place to work. All right. I knew a real theologian once. He had mastered the languages of the Orient and the rites of the ancient nations. The Brahmins, the Chaldeans, the fire worshippers, the Sabians, the Syrians, and the Egyptians, all were as well known to him as the Jews. He was familiar with the various readings of the Bible. For 30 years, he had tried to reconcile the Gospels and to make the fathers of the church agree with one another. He sought to date precisely the Apostles' Creed and that which is, we know under the name of Athanasius, to show how the sacraments were instituted one after the other, to show the difference between the synaxis and the Mass. The difficulty of organizing in his head so many obscure matters and throwing light on such cloudy things which are by their very nature so cloudy often gave him pause. But as such things were the duty of his profession, he gave himself up to them despite his distaste. At length he arrived at knowledge much greater than those of his brethren. But the more he learned, the more skeptical he became of all he knew. As long as he lived, he was tolerant. At his death, he confessed that he had squandered his life uselessly. For my colleagues in theology protest that I am caricaturing their work, I hasten to defend myself on two counts. First, these are not my words, but the words of Voltaire in his mocking portrait of a theologian in his Philosophical Dictionary, first published in 1764. Secondly, his words seem to me to represent much more closely the work of someone in my discipline, the science of religion, the academic study of religion, or Religionswissenschaft, than somebody in theirs. I begin with Voltaire tonight because it was with Voltaire that I began in the 18th century. My work has only gone backwards since then, extending to the 16th and the 17th century. But Voltaire was a very interesting figure And I came to him through the studies that John mentioned at Lancaster, where I studied religious studies and philosophy. In the religious studies program, I studied mostly philosophy of religion, and that therefore meant that I spent much of my time reading these figures from the 18th century onwards. So not only Voltaire, but Hume and Kant, Hegel, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche. A key figure in my training there was John Clayton, a proud Texan, but also a profoundly Anglophile scholar of religion. The tradition at Lancaster was to study all religions equally sympathetically, but also equally critically. Clayton's particular work was on the so-called theistic proofs, the proofs for the existence of God. But like my good colleague Greg Dawes, he regarded persuading somebody who doesn't already believe that gods exist through these proofs was probably the least interesting of the motives for advancing these proofs. What Clayton did was to look at what the proofs, how the proofs were used, not to convince people who didn't believe, but how they were used within religions. So they're used, for example, hermeneutically to clarify the meaning of a text, or polemically, not against atheists, but against other members of the same tradition, to show that if you began from Bloggs' premises, you would inevitably end up in atheism. We all know that atheism is not true, and therefore Bloggs' premises are false. So Clayton did this not just within the Western tradition, but across three major traditions: the Indian tradition, the Islamic tradition, and the Christian tradition. The European tradition, both Christian and Jewish. So for Clayton, he was interested in looking at these proofs and comparing the work of Hume not just with his rivals, but also with Ramanuja, an important early medieval South Indian philosopher. He compared Anselm not only with Al-Ghazali, but also with Udayana, another lesser-known Indian philosopher. And this was very inspiring for me as an undergraduate, and I was very keen to participate in what Clayton regarded as a cross-cultural philosophy of religion, something much deeper than what goes on in most philosophy of religion. In his own IPL, which was the first that I attended, Clayton contrasted the Enlightenment model, which in the end served by rational debate as the achievement of consensus, with the Indian model, where the goal is not the achievement of consensus, but the clarification of difference. So I was interested in participating in his project, but I thought that at first I needed a much deeper grounding in the Western tradition. My own knowledge, as I said, my own study had been mostly in the modern period. At his recommendation, I went to Cambridge. There you go, Ben. Ben loves hearing me talk about Cambridge. We've heard a lot recently about the Oxford vaccine, but Cambridge has not been left behind. Cambridge is also developing a vaccine. It just talks and talks and talks about its time at Cambridge until eventually the virus gets up and leaves. Cambridge was a wonderful place, but the tradition of the study of religion there was very different from what I had known at Lancaster, which was really all I knew of the academic study of religion. At Lancaster, all religions, whatever else they were first of all to be studied as something that human beings do. Cambridge had a much more traditional theological approach. Fortunately, I was not required to attend any lectures. I was free to attend lectures wherever I liked, and most of them that I went to were outside of the divinity faculty. Michael Tanner lecturing on Nietzsche in the philosophy faculty, Patrick Boyd lecturing on Renaissance art, John Smith teaching Sanskrit. But I couldn't help but think about where these two traditions that I'd been exposed to, the Lancaster tradition and the Cambridge tradition, came from and how they had diverged from another. And I think it was in the 18th century that they diverged. Key work in this respect is David Hume's Natural History of Religion. Hume, despite his reputation as the great infidel, was actually very cautious. And the only reason he felt able to publish the Natural History of Religion was because of a distinction that he makes at the beginning between the historical causes of belief, why people believe what they do, and the rational grounds for belief, whether it's rational for them to believe those things. And he was explicit that in this text he was looking only at the historical causes of belief. He left his account, his very skeptical account of the rational grounds for belief in his dialogues concerning natural religion for a work which was only published posthumously. The Natural History of Religion was published in 1757, the same year in which in India, the East India Company's army under Robert Clive defeated the armies of the Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, at Plassey, which is about 150 kilometers north of Calcutta. This was just one battle, but it's conventionally taken to mark the transition of the East India Company from a trading company to a territorial power, and with that, the establishment of British colonialism in India. This was obviously part of a much wider move, expansion and colonization by European powers, one consequence of which was the increasing number of accounts of different religions of the world, which began to flow in to Europe at this time. As I said, there were many of these accounts, and then they went back to the previous centuries. But it's very striking that Voltaire, in his Portrait of the Theologian, places the Brahmins at the head of the list of those whose ancient rites his theologian had squandered his life trying to make sense of. And one of the reasons for this, one of the reasons Voltaire was so interested in these reports, was because he thought that they showed the priority of Indian religion, that it was older than the Christian revelation. And he was therefore particularly excited when, toward the end of 1760, he received a copy of what he believed, or perhaps he chose to believe, was a French translation of the 4 Vedas. The Vedas are the oldest and most authoritative of the Hindu sacred text. And you can see the reason that he was so excited about this was because it antedates Pythagoras, and by extension, therefore, also the Christian revelation by several centuries. So it was another of the sticks that he wanted to use to beat the church. And this text is an example of how a lot of these accounts of Indian religion were used in Europe. They were put to work in debates, first of all, between Catholics and Protestants, and then between Christians and freethinkers, deists, and others like Voltaire. So the texts produced in this encounter have formed the primary focus of my research, which is to say, rather than squandering my life studying the ancient rites of nations, I have instead spent it studying those who squandered their lives studying the ancient rites of the Brahmins, the Chaldeans, and the Egyptians. My colleague Greg is fond of mentioning an incident, a famous incident where Gershom Scholem, who was a pioneer in the academic study of the Kabbalah, or Jewish mysticism. In 57, Scholem was invited to lecture at the Jewish Theological Seminary, a famously rationalist institution in New York. Saul Lieberman, who was a leading Talmudic scholar, famously introduced his lecture by noting that the Kabbalah is complete nonsense, he said. Nonsense is nonsense, but the history of nonsense, that is science. Like Lieberman, I would defend the value of academic inquiry apart from any instrumental or utilitarian value it might also happen to have. But I believe that my own work and the work of my colleagues in the academic study of religion is also valuable for other reasons. One of the primary challenges of our contemporary world is how we are to live together with those who are different from us. There are several different approaches that we might take to this question of cultural difference. One is what I like to call the Walt Disney worldview. In movie after movie, we learn that despite our surface differences, our names, our faces, our skin color, underneath we're all similar. And fundamentally, we all want the same things: love and liberal democracy. It doesn't matter whether you have fins or feet, we love you for who you are on the inside, as Little Mermaid put it. Now, this is nice to think, but it does have the effect of flattening, if not denying entirely, the significance of cultural difference. What if we don't all want liberal democracy? What do we do with those? How would we know? 10 years ago, Joseph Henrich, Stephen Hine, and Araya Norenzayan identified a related problem in the behavioral sciences, and that is that the experimental subjects of 96% of the studies published in top psychology journals were, in their words, weird. Despite some efforts to address this, and John Shaver's work is a notable example, in a recent article, Henrich et al. Conclude that the needle hasn't moved. Most publications still rely mostly or entirely on Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic samples. So there's a problem here. There's a denial of cultural difference. And this is now extended even to the medical sciences. As you know, there have been a lot of studies that have drawn attention recently. Henrich and his colleagues are at pains to point out that they do not intend to imply the absence of a shared human nature. But they do think that there's a problem in generalizing about that human nature entirely on the basis of studies of what is, not only historically, but even in our own time, an entirely unrepresentative sample of humanity, the Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic samples. Now, this is a highly charged area, as Geoffrey Lloyd, a Cambridge philosopher, points out. Any denial of psychic unity, he says, savors of racism. And on the other hand, the assertion of psychic diversity raises the specter of arbitrary relativism, of the incommensurability of belief systems, and possibly their mutual unintelligibility. So this is the problem of cross-cultural understanding. We either project from a small sample, or the potential problem, or we end up worrying and being unable to communicate at all. For Ted Slingerland, the second specter that Lloyd raises here is, for him, the logical outcome of the kind of strong cultural constructivism which has dominated much thinking in the humanities since the 1970s. And a very prominent example of this, important for my own work, was, of course, Edward Said's book, Orientalism. Although Said's claim that Orientalism has systematically distorted European views of Asia depends logically on being able to judge these views by contrast to an undistorted view. At times, like here, he states a rather stronger position, which would seem to undermine any possibility of genuine understanding of others or other cultures. I think it's no accident that, as Slingerland points out, if you take this view, if you insist on the embeddedness of our views in our own language, there's a tendency in emphasizing the difference between cultures to overemphasize uniformity within cultures. Okay, so as he says here, if language determines thought, then everybody who speaks a particular language must think more or less the same things. And I think you can see this in my own area. Some of those who've been most strident about the failure of Europeans to understand India are also those who have insisted on a very high degree of uniformity in their presentation of Indian culture. And the clearest example of this is that a number of them reject the existence of caste altogether. Okay, they say it simply doesn't exist, and thereby they deny the existence of caste discrimination. Okay, but I think there's something of a false dichotomy here. The idea of the mutual intelligibility of cultures is based upon an idea of culture that I think is false. Okay, cultures are not pure bubbles. They have been in exchange with one another, entangled, to use a popular recent way of characterizing it, for as long as they've been in existence. So denying the purity of a culture also opens up pathways to successful mutual understanding, because we share at least something between our cultures. It does also suggest, however, that we can be more or less successful in that attempt at understanding. So how do we know when we attempt to understand across cultures? How do we know that we've been successful and we aren't merely imposing our own understanding or misunderstanding? Well, in seeking to understand others, we're also seeking to understand ourselves. I think this is true by definition. To understand what is different, we also need to understand what it is different from. But Charles Taylor insists that we also have to add a historical depth to this. Our past, he says, is sedimented in our present. We are doomed to misidentify ourselves as long as we can't do justice to where we come from. So history is essential, after all. For Taylor, the contemporary Atlantic world, our culture, broadly speaking, he says is one culture or a group of closely related cultures, which is to be contrasted with all others, including its own predecessor civilization. That is to say, the past is another country. Okay, thinking about it that way. I believe both of these claims to be true in general, but I want to address them here from a personal perspective. We live in a time when there is a demand for reckoning with the past and with the actions of our past selves, our tipuna. As John told you, I was born in what was then Rhodesia. He didn't have the cute photos to show you that. I remember when the statue of Cecil Rhodes was removed from the crossroads at Main Street and 8th Avenue in Bulawayo shortly after independence in 1980. The Bulawayo statue was 3 blocks from the Main Street Methodist Church, where my parents were married, where I was baptized, and where my father served as minister from 1980 until 1984. My mother, as you heard, was born in Botswana. My father migrated to Rhodesia in 1951. They were liberals in the vein of Garfield Todd, a graduate of this university, and a Protestant missionary who in the 1950s became Prime Minister of Rhodesia. Some Kiwis don't believe this. But a Kiwi was Prime Minister of Rhodesia. But my parents remained in Rhodesia throughout the period in which Ian Smith rolled back the modest moves that Todd had made to extend the franchise amongst black Rhodesians. And they remained in their pews in the Main Street Methodist Church when black members of their church were removed from the building for attempting to worship together with their fellow white Methodists, rather than in their Methodist church, which was in the black township. Now, my parents were decent people, I think, but that makes it harder, not easier, to understand how they squared their Christian faith with their life in white Rhodesia. I was 8 at independence when the franchise was extended to all, and my primary school became integrated. So the choice of whether to oppose white minority rule was never exactly forced upon me, although I cannot say that I questioned it. For those of you still looking, I'm there. This experience, this background, was not part of my conscious choice to study the attitudes of a colonizing people towards the religion of a colonized people, but it's hard to resist the conclusion that at some level, this is what I've been addressing. Every great philosophy, according to Nietzsche, is a kind of involuntary and unconscious autobiography. I make no claims to be a great philosopher, therefore here endeth the autobiography. One way of seeking to improve our attempts at cross-cultural understanding is to examine earlier attempts of the same kind. This is Alex's favorite part of the lecture. Enter Bartholomeus Ziegenbalg, a grumpy German with a perpetual bellyache and a pious disposition, but an interesting scholar. Ziegenbalg was a Lutheran missionary in South India, in the heartland of the traditional religious culture of Tamil Nadu, from 1705 until his premature death in 1719. He wrote 2 significant books on Hinduism, neither of which was published in his lifetime. But what makes him particularly exceptional is that he cites his sources, not just in general. Some of his peers at the time, Jesuit missionaries and others, would say in one of their books it says, but with a very German pedanticness, on the 3rd line of the 4th leaf of this text it reads. So he really cites his sources very closely. Many of the texts that he read, he collected a library of about 150 texts in Tamil, are well known, but the one that was most important for him, and which he said was the most important of all Hindu texts, has never been heard of by anybody else, as far as I can determine. Now, this is a text that he names as the Tirikala Chakram. The title means something like the 3 cycles of time, the past, present, and future. He says this book shows the genealogy of their great idols, how all the gods are derived from the being of all beings, the highest God. So for Ziegenbalg, it was by reading this book that he came to understand how the many gods in the Hindu pantheon relate to one another, but also how he came to be convinced that despite all appearances, Hindus are fundamentally monotheists, that is, they believe in just one deity. So he says that this shows the genealogy of their gods, and then his mature work, his second work on Hinduism, written 5 years after he wrote that characterization of the text, he entitled The Genealogy of the Malabarian Gods, that is, the Tamil gods. So given his account of this Tirikala Chakram, which he thought was this very important text, I wondered about the relationship between the Tirikala Chakram, and his own texts. And at this time I was in Germany, where I was studying in the archive of the mission that sent Ziegenbalg out, and you can see on the left here their copy of the manuscript, which is in pretty bad condition, but fortunately there's another copy. It's much easier to read in the Royal Library in Copenhagen. As I was working on these texts, a critical edition of the genealogy was published by an Indian scholar, Daniel Jayaraj. And he suggests that in this text, Ziegenbalg takes the idea of Hindu monotheism from a Dutch text by, Philip Balder, a Dutch chaplain who had worked in Sri Lanka and had written an account of, a travel account which included an account of religion. He said also that Ziegenbalg had taken the idea of a genealogy from the Renaissance work Boccaccio's Genealogia Deorum Gentilium, and the structure of his text from a recently published account of Greco-Roman mythology, also a sort of a pantheistic tradition in an early 18th century text. Now, Ziegenbalg had read Balder, but he dismissed his work as inaccurate because Balder didn't know Tamil and didn't read any text. It wasn't based on textual study. There's no evidence that he'd read either Boccaccio or this text by Benjamin Hederich, which was actually published after Ziegenbalg had left for India. So I thought it was much better to look at Ziegenbalg's actual sources, those that he carefully cites in his own work. When I arrived at Otago shortly after this, I was required as part of my confirmation to successfully obtain a grant, either from the university or from beyond. So I applied to the university to go on a wild goose chase to find the Tirikala Chakram. And very generously, the research committee of the University of Otago provided me some money. Now, according to Hikatinga, this was my Indiana Jones period, in which, with my faithful sidekick, Ilakavan, I roamed the plains of South India on a mighty Enfield bullet, swam across rivers in the jungle, pursued aged scholars in caves and back alleyways, all seeking for hints on how we could find a long-lost text written on palm leaves. So nobody in the 300 years since Ziegenbalg had ever mentioned the text that he thought was the most important of all their texts. With Ilakavan's help, and I would never have found it without it, eventually we did find the text. We found it not in a cave or in the jungle, but in the Government Oriental Manuscripts Library in Chennai, basically where you would expect. But we had a lot of fun. Here, the obstacles to overcome are not Nazi treasure hunters, as for Indiana Jones, or Hindu fanatics, or Soviet spies, but a much more fearsome opponent, the Indian bureaucrat. The text was also hard to find because it's not a freestanding text. It's a section of a larger text, a kind of cosmological work called the Bhuvana Chakram, or the Cycle of Worlds. When we finally found this text, and this is it, and we sat down to read it together, it became clear that not only did Ziegenbalg use it to structure his own text, but that he had provided a full translation of the text. So we could immediately confirm that this was the text that he identified. And at the beginning of his genealogy, or his genealogy, is a table which lays out the structure of the work, but also the structure of the Hindu pantheon. So it shows it lists and it orders the many forms in which God appears in the Hindu tradition. The table directly inverts the structure of the Trikala Chakram. So as I said, this is the cycle of the 3 times. It shows the divisions of time by beginning with the lifetimes of the lowest deities, the sort of celestial beings that are not quite gods, and counts the higher deities in multiples of their lifetime. Okay, so you work your way up until you get up to the final form, which is actually eternal. Paraparavastu, the being who is beyond the beyond. Okay, and Ziegenbalg inverts this and works downwards from, as you would expect perhaps from a Christian, from the primary God through the pantheon. Okay. His version follows also some South Indian accounts where this is how the world was created. So first you have this transcendent being. Emerging from this transcendent being, you have an androgynous but material form, which then divides into male and female powers, and then produces gods. So the first section, this is the first of 4 sections, I would call this a matter of kind of learned theology, or elite theology in the Hindu tradition. At the next level, we have the Trimurti, the so-called Hindu Trinity, Shiva, Vishnu, and Brahma, and their consorts and offspring. So this is the level of kind of popular, but also to some extent elite mythology. The next level down, you have daily worship. These are the Grama Devata, or the village deities, mostly goddesses or fierce male figures in some occasions. And then finally, at the lowest level, you have beings who we might describe as celestials. The famous 333 million devas appear here, along with various others, the guardians of the different directions, and so on. So Tsigamok, far from taking the idea of monotheism or the idea of genealogy from his European sources, is actually following very patiently and very closely his Indian sources. But to know that, you have to rediscover his own Indian sources, among which was this one text. Now, I said he was unusual in the precision with which he cited his sources, but was he unusual also amongst Europeans in following his sources, following Indian sources, rather than projecting his own ideas onto Indian culture? Well, I think to some extent that he was unusual, but he wasn't unique. And to finish, I want to just mention briefly one more interesting case. It takes us back to the 18th century. And this is John Zephaniah Holwell, an interesting figure. He was the grandson of a famous astrologer, so perhaps had an interest in religion in his upbringing. But he spent most of his life as a colonial official in the East India Company. If you are of a certain age, you've probably heard of the Black Hole of Calcutta. You may even have heard of it and not know anything about where this phrase came from. But this was the attack on the East India Company's fort in 1756, which immediately precipitated the war, or the campaign led by Robert Clive, which resulted in the British colonization of Bengal. And this incident has become notorious because it was taken to be representative of the cruelty of the rulers of Bengal. The accounts of it, almost all of them go back to Holwell, and the most sober scholarship suggests that it was mostly made up, or at least very greatly exaggerated. So Holwell was a liar, a famous liar, but he also wrote an account of Hinduism in his interesting historical events relative to the provinces of Bengal, which he published after his return to England. And it was the account of Hinduism in this text that became one of the key sources for Voltaire, partly because of his stress on the early nature of Hinduism. Now, more recently, it's been suggested that Holwell, he claimed in his account of Hinduism to have been translating texts which unfortunately he had lost in the sack of Calcutta, in the Black Hole, and therefore could not anymore produce, but he remembered enough of them, or he recovered bits of them and was able to provide them. More recent scholars have claimed that as he lied about the whole of Calcutta, so he simply made up the text that he claimed to be translating. There are various levels of the argument here, but I just want to focus on one of them, which has been advanced by a Swiss scholar, Urs Upp, who suggests that the prominence of angels in Holwell's text, here's a very strange account of Hindu angels, shows the influence of a radical English deist, Jacob Ilive, who published who taught that this earth is hell, as you can see in his title page of his work here, and that we are angels trapped here as punishment for our sins, and that ultimately our destiny is to go off and live on other planets and rule them. So some kind of weird sort of New Agey kind of stuff going on here. And Holwell had read Ilive, and he does make a lot of angels, but I think the reason that Holwell mentions angels in his text is not because he was copying Ilive, but rather because he was relying on an earlier tradition and an earlier phase of cross-cultural encounter that was very important for the British in India, well into the 19th century. So it's more likely, I think, that Holwell was using not Ilive, but a Sanskrit text, but not directly, but rather via a Persian translation, and a Persian translation made through the medium of an oral Hindi kind of intermediary. Okay? And this is the standard method by which the Mughals, the Muslim rulers of India, for several centuries before the British, had translated text. So this is a leaf from an illustrated text, the version of the Mahabharata, translated for Akbar the Great. And you can't quite see it, but in the front of the picture there, you see one scholar pointing to another who's writing something down. What's interesting is that they were translating into Persian. You can see Persian script at the top and bottom of the painting. But in the middle there, he's writing down in Devanagari, the character used for Hindi, right? So he's actually, I surmise that this is an Indian scholar giving an oral account in Hindi, and the Persian scholar is writing it down in Hindi, and then subsequently it will be translated and presented to Akbar in Persian. Okay, and in these texts, the word for angel, deva in Hindi, but pronounced in the Bengali fashion, debta, this is translated as shining one. But for Muslim scholars, the fact that there were multiple devas meant they couldn't use the word God. They couldn't talk about the multiple gods. So they translated it instead using the word for angel. And this, Holwell, then following this Persian text, this is why he talked about angels in Hindu mythology. And there are no angels in Hindu mythology, but the devas do regularly get themselves cursed to be born on earth. One of Adi's favorite stories from the Mahabharata tells this story. I don't have time to tell the story, but it's a very common episode that the devas do get trapped. So I think that Holwell, too, was probably following his sources, but would have to find those sources in order to be sure. What I've tried to suggest is that what distinguishes those European writers who came closest to understanding Indian religion is their painstaking study of texts. And this is the boring truth that is the same for us today. If we really want to understand others, I'm afraid there is no substitute for learning their languages and patiently reading their texts. Having quoted several great philosophers, Voltaire, Hume, The Little Mermaid, I close with another, George Best. The University of Otago and the New Zealand taxpayer have allowed me the great privilege of spending much of my working life studying the errors of the past. The rest, I confess, I have squandered.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Tony Ballantyne aho, ko o te manukura o te kiti aranui ke te whare wānanga nei. My name is Tony Ballantyne and I'm the PVC Humanities here at the University of Otago, and it's with great pleasure I deliver a vote of thanks to Professor Sweetman. He has delivered an excellent lecture, a set of reflections on his own academic pathway and on some of the recurrent concerns that stand at the centre of his research and teaching. I think he's illuminated really important disciplinary matters and explored some of the questions that persistently stand at the heart of human life. Almost 60 years ago now, the great Chicago historian W.H. McNeill argued, quote, "Encounters with strangers are the main drive wheel of human history." And this lecture has trained our attention on a key dimension of such encounters, cross-cultural understandings of religion. Considering how we understand people different from us and how we make sense of those who follow other gods and whose languages, devotional practices and institutions diverge from our own remains an urgent undertaking. That is the case both at a scholarly level and in terms of our day-to-day navigation of a world that has been made and remade by shifting patterns of migration and mobility, empire building and evangelization. Professor Sweetman has built a substantial scholarly reputation in part because he exhibits many of those qualities that he highlighted in his sketch of Professor John Clayton at Lancaster, especially his ability to navigate between worlds. And we've seen this evening. Professor Sweetman has traced some key questions about how we understand cultural difference and the nature of religion through a sequence of important texts, thinkers and locations. Although I think none of us were perhaps expecting Disney's Little Mermaid nor the great George Best to be quoted. But that Little Mermaid quotation is important because it underlines just how fundamental the questions that Will is grappling with are. He has reminded us of the value of meticulous attention to texts, the careful interrogation of their provenance and purchase, and the crucial importance of scrutinising the ways in which they are shaped by their engagements with earlier texts and arguments. And Professor Sweetman has also looked back on his own academic journey. He's taken us from Bulawayo to Lancaster to South India and to our location here in the south of Te Waipounamu. I'd like to pick up on one thing that John observed and that Will touched on, and that Will and John and their colleagues are part of an outstanding cohort of scholars in religious studies here at Otago. And that's a group that Professor Sweetman himself has been pivotal in assembling. There is a very significant tradition of the scientific study of religion at Otago that dates back to the late 1960s, and that tradition has flourished and grown in recent years in ways that owe a great deal to the leadership and work that Will has provided. Now, IPLs are incredibly important events, and they are always a highlight for all the university leaders who attend them. But I have to admit that this one is particularly special for me, in part because of the convergence of my own academic voyage with Will's at an early stage. At Cambridge, Will and I worked in what we might think of as adjacent intellectual neighbourhoods, and you'll notice that we have matching roads, as does Professor Blakey. So we worked in adjacent intellectual neighbourhoods, if you like. His study of European accounts of Hinduism was, if you humour me, the Corstorphine to the Caversham of my work on colonial knowledge in British India. We were at the same college, Wolfson, and we were part of an unusually cosmopolitan team of student porters who ran the college at weekends and nights. On thinking back to that time, 2.5 decades now, I'm not only struck on reflection that Will at that stage exhibited a deep interest in questions about methodology and how we understand and make sense of religion, but that he clearly then also exhibited the same warmth, collegiality and wit. And those things stand out to me because they're qualities that are not always stick on the ground in Cambridge. Thinking back, I also remember quite clearly that I had a luxuriant head of hair, and that annoyingly, in hindsight, that Will looked almost exactly the same as he does now. And most importantly, being in John, for the record, I did not row at Cambridge. As we've all seen tonight, it's no surprise to anyone that Will is a great teacher, he is an excellent institutional citizen, and he is an important leader for us. I know that all of us here from across the university and beyond are delighted to be sharing this special occasion with you, Will. So could you all please join me in thanking Will? I have a small gift to give him, and then I invite you to follow the academic party for a small reception. So. Yes.